Hi, I'm John Stevenson, and we're going to be looking at the birth and childhood narratives of Jesus. Now, Matthew and Luke are the two gospel writers that tell us details about the birth and the childhood of Jesus. Matthew seems to be giving us from Joseph's perspective. He makes the announcement to Joseph, whereas Luke gives the announcement to Mary. Matthew gives us a brief mention of the birth of Jesus in Bethlehem. Luke's also mentions the birth in Bethlehem, but gives us a bit more details about the manger and the room and the announcement to the shepherds. In Matthew's account, we read of the visit of the Magi from the east. No mention of those in Luke. Instead, Luke talks about the dedication of Jesus, and there's also a cleansing ritual that would have taken place on behalf of Mary that took place in the temple. And so Luke mentions the temple. Matthew mentions the Magi coming from the east to Jerusalem and then down to Bethlehem. So each writer has a few points of agreement, but there's a great deal in one account that's not in the other. Um, and part of this is that I think you're getting Joseph's point of view and you're getting Mary's point of view. But also, I've said before that two writers do not independently express thought alike. And that means they're not getting together to try to arrange their story one from the other. They're each speaking and giving an independent account of the details of the birth of Jesus. Now, let's begin with the announcements that are made before anybody had been born. We have and these are all in Luke. Luke chapter 1, after his brief introduction, Luke begins to talk about the announcement to Zacharias. Zacharias was a priest. He and his wife was from a priestly household as well. And the problem is that she was barren. They were advanced in age, and they were not able to have children. And now it comes up that it's his turn to do the priestly duty, and one of the duties, and you would actually cast lots to see if you could get this. The lot had fallen to him, where he was going to be permitted to go into the temple. Now, not all priests could go into the temple. One or two priests would go each day. It was decided by lot, and it was a very high privilege. And now it's his turn to go in and to offer incense upon the altar. He's from a division. What had happened, the priesthood back in the days of David and Solomon had been organized into 24 courses, 24 families. And the eighth of those families was the division of Abijah. And like I said, he would be chosen by lot. And so this was his special time. And he goes in to offer incense upon the altar there inside the temple. And while he is there, all of a sudden an angel shows up. Now, angels don't show up all the time. Even in the Bible, angels don't show up all the time. It's not a regular sort of thing. And so he's not expecting it. He's quite surprised. And the angel announces that he's going to have a child. And he hears this announcement and he says, there's a problem with that. First of all, my wife is barren. And secondly, we're way too old for that sort of thing. So I don't know how old he was, but old enough where he didn't really believe that this could take place. And because of his unbelieving response, the angel says, "You've spoken words of unbelief. Now you're not going to be able to speak anything until the child has been born." And so he comes out of the temple after having, of course, he's already offered the incense, and then he's had this conversation with the angel. And normally, priests coming out of the temple would offer a benediction to those that were gathered outside. And he comes out and he opens his mouth and nothing comes out. And he gesticulates. He makes gestures. And it's evident that he's seen something inside. He's pointing inside, and I don't know what kind of actions that he's making, but perhaps acting it out. But he's unable to speak, and then he eventually finishes his priestly duty, and he goes home, and he and his wife, she becomes pregnant, and so the promise is fulfilled. And next, the scene shifts up to Nazareth, to a young virgin girl, and Luke makes it very clear. She's not just a young girl, but she's a young girl who is a virgin. And the angel shows up. So again, we have uh, an individual. This time it's a young girl. The angel shows up and he gives the message, "You are going to have a child." And she says, "Wait a minute, there's a problem." Now, the problem isn't that she's too old. In fact, she may have been very young. We're not told how old she is. But the angel says, she says, I'm unable to have any children because I'm not married yet. Now she's betrothed. She's what we would call engaged, although betrothal was a bit more serious than that, in that in a betrothal you had already exchanged vows, but you had not come together and consummated the marriage. There would be a time of waiting, and she's in that time of waiting. And the angels, apparently his message is that you're going to have the child fairly soon, you know. And she says, well, we need to wait until I get married. No, the Holy Spirit is going to come upon you. And so notice how God is overcoming the problem. This is going to be a Holy Spirit conception. Now, sometimes we talk about a virgin birth, and it's true, she will be a virgin at the time that the birth is given. But the miraculous part isn't the birth, it's going to be actually sort of a natural birth. It will be the conception that is supernatural. The Holy Spirit is going to come upon her, and she will conceive, and she'll have a son. And here's the sign that's given to you. Now, Zacharias had been given a sign. His sign is you won't be able to speak. You'll be rendered mute until the time of the prophecy is fulfilled. The sign that Mary is given is that your cousin Elizabeth, she's pregnant. She's with child, the one that was barren. And so you have a sign as well. And Mary says, the handmaiden of the Lord, be that as you will. And she gives a response that shows her submission to God's will. And so what she does now, she doesn't get up immediately, but shortly, very shortly, she goes down to visit Elizabeth, who is living in Judea. So Mary's in Galilee. Elizabeth is in Judea, one of those cities that had been given over for the priesthood. We're not told what city it is. And Mary comes in to see Elizabeth, and there's a child in Elizabeth, of course, and she's well pregnant by now. The child she's showing, and she feels the child leap in her womb. That's an interesting thing. Where John the Baptist, who's still in the womb, and there's life there, where he responds to her presence, and Elizabeth notes it, and she actually sings a song that gives testimony to the Lord and to what has taken place and to what is going to take place on behalf of Mary. And then Mary responds with a song. Now, it's interesting, if and we're not going to do a detailed study right now, but if you look at the Song of Mary, there's a song in the Old Testament that mirrors it, a song of a woman who's pregnant. And that's the song of Hannah in 1 Samuel chapter 2. In fact, Mary, I think, perhaps borrows some lines from that song. I think it's likely that Mary actually knew the song. You know how you know songs, the popular songs. Well, for Mary, the popular songs would have been biblical songs, like the Psalms and like the Song of Hannah. And so she borrows from that song, but she updates it to express the things that are happening in her life. She uses that Song of Hannah, and she is there with Elizabeth for a 3-month visit. Now, when we get to Matthew, we're going to see apparently she comes back and she's 3 months along in her pregnancy. But we'll look at that in a moment. Meanwhile, we're not talking about Joseph yet. Meanwhile, Luke chapter 1 and verse 57, we have Elizabeth giving birth now to this promised child of hers. And on the 8th day, because you would always wait if you were Jewish, to circumcise the child on the 8th day. And it was then that the child would be given a name. This goes back all the way to the time of Abraham, where Abraham is circumcised and his name is changed. And So the name would be changed. And so here, instead of changing the name, they're giving the child the name. And of course, Zacharias has been quiet all this time. And they're thinking, well, we can call him Zacharias Jr. And instead, he calls for some sort of writing implement, which tells me that he can read and write, at least some basic reading and writing. And he writes out, his name is John. Notice it's not his name is going to be John. It doesn't say it in the future tense. His name is John because God has already named him, even though officially he hasn't been named at the circumcision. And so, so his name is given as John. And now Zacharias gives first of all, he speaks. He's no longer mute. He's now able to speak. And he comes forth with a song of praise. So in Luke chapter 1, there's a number of songs of praise that are given throughout this chapter. Now we switch over to Matthew's account. And in Matthew's account, it's going to follow the same story, but from Joseph's perspective. And it starts off, chapter 1, verse 18. Now the birth of Jesus Christ was as follows. When his mother Mary had been betrothed to Joseph, before they came together, she was found to be with child by the Holy Spirit. We've just given a synopsis of everything that's in Luke chapter 1, in one verse here in Matthew. And so the point is, they've been betrothed. Now, as I said, betrothal was a very serious thing. The only way to get unbetrothed, once you were betrothed, you could do it one of two ways. One of the parties could die, or the other way was through divorce. And so they were legally married, but they had not consummated the marriage. That's what it means to be betrothed. There's a period of waiting while they plan and prepare to build up their home together. And the problem is, before they come together, notice she is found to be with child by the Holy Spirit. This was what was promised in Luke chapter 1, but now we find out it has taken place. The problem with this is Joseph has been let in on it. Mary has been, she's been given this announcement by the angel, and she has gone to visit her cousin, but Joseph hasn't heard this word. And so in verse 19, Joseph, her husband, being a righteous man and not wanting to disgrace her, so he's righteous, that means he's thinking she's been unfaithful. And he cannot marry a woman who's been unfaithful because he's a righteous man. But he doesn't want to disgrace her. So there is both righteousness and yet there is mercy in his heart. So he plans he doesn't want to see her killed. Remember, that's one of the ways you can get out of a betrothal. The other way is for a divorce, and that's what he decides. He desires to put her away. That's the language of divorce, to divorce her, but he wants to do it in secret. Now, to make it an official divorce, you did not have to go to a court of law. You did not have to go before a judge. To divorce someone in the first century, you would write it out. They didn't have a lot of paper, so typically we have actually found divorce cases where it was written on a piece of broken pottery. That's what they would use for paper back then. And so you would write it out and you would hand it to her, and now you were officially divorced. And so this is his plan. Notice, he could denounce her publicly. That would lead to her death. He could divorce her privately. As Joseph sees it, those are his only two options. What he does not realize, he doesn't even consider this, he could take her as his wife. And that is what the Lord is going to direct him to do. And so in verse 20, when he had considered this, behold, an angel of the Lord appeared to him in a dream. Now, remember, you don't see the word Joseph a lot in the Bible. It wasn't an uncommon name, but you don't find it that many times in the Bible. And of course, the first time you see the name Joseph in the Bible is back in the Old Testament with Joseph. Can I call him this? Joseph the Dreamer. Well, here's the other Joseph the Dreamer, because the story in Matthew chapter 1 and chapter 2 is going to revolve all around the dreams. And so an angel of the Lord appeared to him in a dream, saying, Joseph, son of David, because, by the way, he is a son of David. Matthew has already set this out in a genealogy in chapter 1 verses 1 through 17. So he's called Joseph, son of David. Do not be afraid to take Mary as your wife, for that which has been conceived in her is of the Holy Spirit. Now, this comes as a total surprise, a total shock to Joseph. He did not expect, in fact, he had never heard of the idea that there would be any sort of virgin birth, that those things simply don't take place. But he's told it's going to be. Now, Matthew's going to quote in a few minutes, he's going to quote Isaiah chapter 7 and verse 14, that prophecy that speaks of how a virgin shall conceive. Although the way they probably would have translated it back then, if you look at the Hebrew, it probably would have been a young maiden will conceive. The emphasis isn't so much on her virginity, although that's sort of assumed with a young unmarried girl, but that she would conceive and bear a child. They did not take that to be a messianic prophecy. That was not assumed to be messianic. I think it's going to be taken and applied here in Matthew, but they were not expecting a virgin birth, and so Joseph is being told by the angel, for that which has been conceived in her is of the Holy Spirit, and she will bear a son, and you will call his name Jesus. Now, there's a play on words here. It doesn't so much work in the Greek, it works in the Hebrew. And when I say it works in the Hebrew, this is written to us in Greek, but the name Jesus isn't a Greek name. The name Jesus, or Esu is how you say it in Greek. The way you would say it in Hebrew would be Yeshua, and Yeshua means Savior. And so here's the play on words. You call him named Jesus, for it is he who will save his people from their sins. So the name points to what he would do. Now we turn now to Matthew. Well, actually, both Matthew and Luke speak about the birth of Jesus. Let's go back to Luke. Luke chapter, because Luke's going to give us greater detail. Matthew just gives it to us really in one verse. They both agree that it's in Bethlehem. Luke chapter 2, and let's just start in verse 1, although we've already discussed in a previous lecture about the date and so on. But in those days, a decree went out from Caesar Augustus that a census be taken of all the inhabited earth. This was the first census taken while Quirinius was governor of Syria. Maybe there would, in fact, I think there would be later on a second census. That's another story. Verse 3, and everyone was on his way to register for the census, each to his own city. And this census is going to cause a lot of people to move, but it's going to cause, in particular, Mary and Joseph to do some movement. And that is what we see in verse 4. Joseph also went up from Galilee, from the city of Nazareth. This is the place where he had been staying, but he's going to his ancestral home. Some people have wondered, was this his first home? And at somewhere along the line, for some reason, he had moved up to this little village of Nazareth. My answer is, I don't know. But he noticed he goes from Nazareth to Judea, to the city of David, which is called Bethlehem. Bethlehem was a very small town, had always been a small town, had been a small town back in the days of King David. It was still a small town, but notice he's going to Bethlehem because he was of the house and family of David. So this is it says it's an ancestral thing. And he's going there in order to register along with Mary, who was engaged to him and was with child. Now, we've already seen the leading up to it. They're still betrothed, they're still engaged, but now she is pregnant. They're going to Bethlehem. Oh, incidentally, the name Bethlehem. Beth is the Hebrew word for house, and it's Hebrew. It's a Hebrew name. Lechem is the word for bread. So literally, the house of bread. It's an interesting title because Jesus is going to be described in the Gospels as the bread of life. And I think it's sort of appropriate that the house, the bread of life would be born in a town which its name really just means the bakery. That's what the house of bread means. It's the place where you bake bread, the place where you make bread. And you can go to Bethlehem today. Now today it's grown into quite a large town. I mean, you can see some of the buildings are quite large in the distance. I'm actually standing in the town square of Bethlehem. You can see it's a city on a hill, but nowadays it's expanded to other hills in the region. You can go to, if you go to the Church of the Nativity, and that's where we are looking at this picture. They've built a big church on where tradition has it that Jesus was born. I don't know if that's the exact location, but there's a church there. Go actually to the head of the church, and then there's a stairway leading down downstairs to an area where it is said this was the actual location. Again, that's just tradition. What I personally think is much more interesting is that the entrance of the church, you can see the outline of the original entrance, and that was sealed up supposedly back in the Crusader days. And the reason it was sealed up was because the Crusader knights had this habit of taking the horses and riding their horses right into the church. And so they sealed it up, and instead they made a single small entrance, and to get into that entrance, you can see somebody going through the entrance. You have to bend down. Doesn't matter if you're a king or a commoner, you must bow down to come into this church. And I think there's something especially delightful about that. Well, our story continues, Luke chapter 2 and verse 6. While they were there, that is in the town of Bethlehem, the days were completed for her to give birth. So it doesn't say they arrived and she gave birth that night. Apparently, they were there for some time. And she gives birth. It's a natural birth, as I said, a supernatural conception, a natural birth. Verse 7, and she gave birth to her firstborn son. Of course, she had been a virgin prior to this, so no other children. And she wrapped him in cloths. That's what you would do to a newborn child. You would wrap the child. The child had been for 9 months in a womb, and now the child is out. And so you wrap him up to sort of give that child the security and the safety and also the warmth. And now that was commonplace, but what's not quite so common, and laid him in a manger. Now, usually when you see mangers depicted, at least in American culture or in European culture, you always see the manger that's made of wood. They did not make mangers of wood back then. Mangers were always made of stone. Here's a picture of a manger. This one is in Jezreel, up in the area on the southern end of Galilee. But you would always make a manger of stone, and we're going to see how perhaps there's some symbolism there. But notice he was laid in a manger because there was no room for them in the inn. Now, they're in cloths, they're in a manger, but the part that I want to look at is there was no room for them in the inn. And how often have I imagined, they go into check into a hotel, and there's no vacancies, so they have to go out into the stable. That's probably not what's taking place here, because the term that's translated here in is not the same word that's translated in when Jesus tells the story of the Good Samaritan who takes the injured man to an inn and allows him to stay there. That's actually a different Greek word that's used. This word is the same word that later on Luke uses to describe the upper room where Jesus eats his Last Supper with the disciples. And they're not checked into a hotel there. There's what would call maybe a guest room, a room that's sort of separate from the rest of the family, a special room. But there's no room in the guest room. There's no room in the special room. Why? Well, perhaps there were other residents, other visitors that were using it. And so because of that, he's laid, now it doesn't say he's laid in a stable, it says he's laid in a manger. Well, again, in sort of working class families, you would often have a section of the house. You know how you go into a section of the house today, and somebody might have either a carport or they might have a garage, and that's a portion of the house in which you put your car. Well, they didn't have cars back then, but instead you would have a portion of the house that was set aside in which you would bring in your animals, and there you might have a manger. So, it's not like he's being sent out to the barn, but he's in a portion of the house, probably still enclosed, and laying in a manger. And we'll see how that actually becomes part of a sign, but we're not there yet. Now, in the same region, there were some shepherds staying out in the fields, Now here again, when you see this term fields, oftentimes I think like the cornfield or the wheat field. No, 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 no. Out in the fields means they're out away from where the crops are planted. And we know this because they're shepherds, and shepherds didn't keep their sheep where you would keep the crops because the sheep might start eating the crops. You don't want to do that. You're going to lose all your crops. Instead, they would take them like sort of away, maybe over the hill and away from the village, away from the farms, away from the crops, out into what they referred to as the fields. This is actually part of the wilderness. And to leave Bethlehem and you just go a mile or two, excuse me, to the east, and you're in that wilderness area. In fact, you can just go downhill from there all the way down to the Dead Sea. There's not a lot in between that east area all the way down to the Dead Sea. And so here were some shepherds staying out in the fields, keeping watch over their flock by night. There's some folks who have said, well, this couldn't have taken place in December because the shepherds didn't keep their flocks out in the fields at night. Well, actually they did, and they still do to this day. It doesn't get that cold there. It gets a little chilly. In fact, I'm in December as I'm teaching this, and it's been down to 58 degrees in Bethlehem just today. You say, well, that's not too bad, and it's not. So I'm not saying it necessarily took place in December. We don't know when it took place, but they're in the fields. They're keeping watch over their flock by night. Oftentimes at night, they would gather the sheep into a sheepfold, that is, a place that had sort of a stone fencing around it, just to make sure they don't wander out in the darkness. Verse 9, and an angel of the Lord suddenly stood before them, and the glory of the Lord shone around them, and they were terribly frightened. Because again, angels don't normally show up. This is an unusual, once-in-a-lifetime event. And here the shepherds, their night is interrupted by the appearance of this angel. Verse 10, but the angel said to them, do not be afraid. I've kiddingly said, that angels, in your angel training manual, it probably says, whenever you appear to a human being, the first thing you say is, don't be afraid. Well, that's what they say here. The angel says, don't be afraid, for behold, I bring you good news of great joy, which will be for all the people. For today in the city of David, there has been born for you a Savior who is Christ the Lord. Remember the word Christ. That's the term for Messiah. That's the Greek version of the Hebrew word Messiah. And so here's an announcement of the child that has been born. Verse 12, this will be a sign for you. Now, a sign is supposed to be something that's unusual. If you say, there's a baby, well, there's lots of babies, so that isn't necessarily a sign. Well, there's a baby and he's got hair. Well, babies always have hair. Or a baby and he's in diapers. That's not much of a sign. Here's a sign for you. You will find the baby wrapped in cloths. That in itself isn't necessarily by itself that much of a sign. That's what you did with babies. And lying in a manger. That's the unusual part. But notice that both of these are mentioned. The baby is wrapped in cloths, lying in a manger. I'm giving you here another example of a manger. But let's look at our first example, and I'm not sure which one it looked like. These are both mangers. Mangers are always made of stone. What makes this a sign? A sign always points to something. This is how they're going to know the baby, but also sometimes there's something significant about the sign, and I think it's entirely possible that's the case here. You see, the baby's going to be wrapped in cloths and lying on a stone slab. And maybe, now this is just a little bit of, and I don't like to do this a lot, but I can't help but wonder, maybe this is part of a sign of who the child is supposed to be. That the child is wrapped, this little tiny body is going to be wrapped in cloths, lying on a slab of stone rock. As if to point out what the child has come for. The child has come to die, and then once dead, that lifeless body will be wrapped and laying on a stone slab in a tomb. And here is this little newborn child acting out what he will eventually be called to do. Well, we have the birth of Jesus in Bethlehem. And notice, and we've already looked at this, so I'm just going to go through this really quickly. Then on day one, we have the shepherds and their visit. There's been born this day, so I don't think too much time passed between the birth of Jesus and the visit of the shepherds. Next, we have the circumcision of Jesus described, Luke chapter 2, verse 21. And then at least 40 days later, the 40 days would pass, and then the mother of this firstborn child was required to go to the temple, and they do this. They do exactly what they're told to do. They present Jesus in the temple. This is Luke chapter 2, verses 22 and 38. And then sometime after this, maybe that night or the next day, of course, it could have been several days. I suppose it could even be several weeks later. We're not told specifically. But the Magi are going to come to Bethlehem after visiting Herod the Great. Now, let's go back to the temple. And here we have a picture of the court of the women. Of course, the reason it's called the court of the women is because women could go into this court, including the men, but they could not go past what was called the Nicanor gate. Notice how you see these big giant doors. They were made of bronze, and you had 15 steps leading up to them. But past this point, a woman was not allowed to go. And so she would come here and present the newborn child. There would be a rite of purification on her part, where she would be required to do a sacrifice, and they do sort of the poor man's sacrifice, indicating they weren't very wealthy. They were poor people. They were common working class people. And she would go through a ritual of purification and give a sin offering because she had brought a child into the world. And of course, all have sinned. Not saying Jesus had sinned, but it was part of the legal requirement. And then they would redeem the firstborn. This was also part of the requirement. This was the first child that she had had, and so she was required to redeem it. Now, that's not mentioned in Luke's account. I'm sure it took place, but Luke doesn't mention that. And perhaps the reason he doesn't mention it is because here the firstborn is going to be the one who himself will be our Redeemer. And while they are there, two individuals come up. The first is Simeon. He is an old man who has been promised that before he dies, he will see the Lord's anointed. And he comes up and he sees the one and he recognizes, apparently the Lord reveals it to him, and he sings a song. As I said, Luke chapters 1 and 2 are filled with music. In fact, we could describe them as a musical. I like that. So Simeon sings a song, and he also gives a prophecy about how this one and he speaks to Mary about how this one will strike to your very heart. And then Anna comes up, and she has some words to say also, and she is a widow woman who has been serving, not in the temple proper, but in and around the temple, has been finding ways to serve the Lord, and she's been doing that. And she speaks as well to the birth of this child. Now we switch back to Matthew chapter 2, and here we pick up with the arrival of Magi from the east who arrive in Jerusalem. Now, when we speak of the Magi, first of all, if we speak of the east, the people that live to the east are the Parthians, and the Parthians had actually invaded Israel back in just prior to 40 BC. It had been that time when the father of Herod the Great had died. Herod was just a young man back then, and the Jews had revolted. And at that time, the Parthians had come in, I think, really at the request of some of the Jewish people. They had sort of teamed up. Let's get rid of the Romans, and let's get rid of course, Herod's father Antipater had just died, and let's get rid of Herod, and let's get rid of his brother Faisal. And Faisal was actually captured and put to death. And they tried to capture Herod. He actually had to fight a battle to escape, a battle that was fought, interestingly enough, at Bethlehem. And he had built a fortress later on at Bethlehem we're going to look at to commemorate that battle. But Herod had escaped, had made his way all the way back to Rome. But here are those same representatives from the Parthians, and they are known as Magi. Now, I'm just assuming the Magi are from the east, Parthia. Others have suggested maybe they're from Arabia instead, and I suppose it's possible. The Magi, though, that term Magi, if they were from the Parthians, they were an ancient order of priests, and they referred to them as Magi. The same term could be used to refer to magicians. If they were from Parthia, they were monotheists. They believed in one God, and they were also instrumental in appointing and in crowning the kings of Parthia. So think about the irony here, as these Parthian kingmakers, they show up, and these, like I said, the Magi hadn't done this, but the Parthians had fought Herod in 40 BC, had tried to remove him from the land. He had to flee all the way to Rome, only to come back a few years later, and Parthians had turned around and gone home. But he had fought to take back his kingdom, and now here he is king. And suddenly there's these Magi who are an ancient order of priests from Parthia, who one of their duties is to crown Parthian kings, but they're here to crown one who has been born king of the Jews. And so Herod the king hears of it, and he's troubled, and all Jerusalem with him. They're not excited about this idea. Verse 4, and gathering together all the chief priests and scribes of the people, he began to inquire of them where the Christ, that is the Messiah, was to be born. And notice the scribes say, oh, we know where the Messiah is supposed to be born. He's supposed to be born in Bethlehem of Judea, for so it has been written by the prophet. And now they quote the prophecy. The prophecy is from the Old Testament book of Micah, Micah chapter 5 and verse 2. And here's the prophecy, and you, Bethlehem, land of Judah, are by no means least among the leaders of Judah, for out of you shall come forth a ruler who will shepherd my people Israel. And they're quoting this prophecy in Micah chapter 5 verse 2, where they knew the Messiah is supposed to be born in Bethlehem. Now Herod isn't that familiar with the Old Testament, with the Hebrew scriptures, so he has to ask, and he does, and he's given that, and he passes that information on to the Magi. And so he secretly calls the Magi. Notice how he's got a plan, he's got a plot. He secretly called the Magi and ascertained from them the time the star appeared. They've seen a star. They saw it while they were in the east, and they've come now. Of course, the star hasn't guided them. They just saw the star, but they've come to Jerusalem, the capital, asking, where's the one who's born King of the Jews? And Herod is sending them to Bethlehem, but he's also asking them about when the star had appeared. Apparently, it had appeared back when, I don't know exactly how long, but back when they had been in the east, wherever it was, Parthia or Arabia or wherever it is. Now, the nature of the star, we're not told. There have been all sorts of suggestions. Kepler, the astronomer, had suggested it might have been an alignment of planets. And sure enough, back in 7 BC, there was an alignment of Jupiter and Saturn and Mars. They all sort of look like. It doesn't happen all that often for all three of those to align. Actually, quite rare. But there was an alignment of those 3 planets where they all sort of came very close together. And astronomers and astrologers and magi would have noted that sort of thing. Was that the star that we're speaking of? I really don't think so. I can't say for sure. Because notice what happens. Herod sends them down to Bethlehem. He sent them to Bethlehem. Bethlehem's only about 4 miles south of Jerusalem. And he says to them, go and make careful search for the child, and when you have found him, report to me that I too may come and worship him. Now, Herod doesn't want to worship the child. He's just telling them that because Herod wants to have the child killed. He wants to protect his throne. Well, verse 9, having heard the king, they went on their way, and lo, the star, which they had seen in the east, went on before them until it came and stood over where the child was. Now, this sounds like something beyond just an alignment of planets. I could be wrong. Maybe it is that. And when they saw the star, apparently they hadn't. It sounds like they hadn't seen it. Maybe I don't want to make the passage stand on too independently, but that's what it sounds like. They rejoiced exceedingly with great joy. And notice the star goes and stands over them. This sounds like, again, something supernatural. This sounds like something that God sent. Well, what was it? And my answer, I don't know. People have said, well, was it a comet? Was it this alignment of planets? Was it something special? I don't know. But it causes their rejoicing. And they came into the house and saw the child with Mary, his mother, and they fell down and worshipped him. And opening their treasures, they presented to him. And notice how 3 gifts are mentioned. Now, we're not told how many magi there were. The fact that there are 3 gifts have led some to speculate that there were 3 magi, but we're not told that that's the case. We're only told 3 gifts, gifts of gold and frankincense and myrrh. Now, those are valuable gifts. Gifts of gold, obviously. That's a very kingly gift. Gifts of frankincense. Incense, remember, was used in worship in the temple. A very, can I call it this? A very priestly gift. And myrrh had a number of uses, but one of those was it was used in embalming, which speak maybe to Jesus as being king as well as priest, as well as doing a sacrificial ministry. Maybe. I don't want to make too much of this. But remember how Mary and Joseph had given the offering, the poor person's offering. Well, now suddenly they've just come into some money. Now it's for Jesus, but it's also for them, and they're going to use it to bring up Jesus. We don't see Jesus living a lifestyle of wealth. But perhaps now instead of being poorer class, perhaps they're going to be living a lifestyle of maybe a little bit upper middle class. Joseph is still going to be described as a worker, a craftsman. Sometimes we translate it as carpenter, but there's not a lot of wood. Just look at the picture. That's Bethlehem. You don't see lots and lots of trees. You're not out there cutting trees down a lot. But he was a craftsman, a worker. We might say a construction worker, and that would work as well. And these gifts are given now to them. But verse 12, and having been warned by God in a dream not to return to Herod, they departed for their own country by another way. And so they go another way. Now notice in our picture, off in the distance, there's what looks like a mountain. In fact, it looks like a volcano if you didn't know any better. And you can see that from Bethlehem. I'm taking this picture standing in downtown Bethlehem. And that's known by a certain name. And that's going to play a part in our story. Because verse 13, when they had departed, behold, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream, saying, arise and take the child and his mother and flee to Egypt, and remain there until I tell you, for Herod's going to search for the child to destroy him. So the Magi go back to where they came from without telling Herod. Joseph is told in a dream, go and flee to Egypt. I think perhaps that gift of gold, frankincense, and myrrh are going to help supply their financial needs while they're in Egypt, and maybe a bit beyond that. But as I said, that mountain that's in the distance, it's actually a fortress. It's called the Herodium. Notice in the foreground, you can see it looks like a big, giant Olympic-sized swimming pool, and that's exactly what it is. There's no water in it today, but there was back in Herod's day. And he had a big, giant fortress there, and with lookout towers, where from those towers, his soldiers could see anybody going any which way. They could see Magi going their way. They could see Mary and Joseph escaping. But because they're warned by God in a dream, they're going to escape. And neither the Magi nor Joseph and Mary are going to be captured by Herod, even though this famous tower, Herodium, that overlooks Bethlehem. From there, you can see anybody that leaves or enters Bethlehem. And Herod is on the lookout. Well, we read in verse 14, and he arose and took the child and his mother by night and departed for Egypt and was there until the death of Herod. Now, how long was that? We don't know. And so I don't want to speculate. Herod the Great dies in the spring of 4 BC, but we don't know exactly when Jesus was born. But he dies, he's there until the death of Herod, that what was spoken by the Lord through the prophet might be fulfilled, saying, and this is a prophet, and it actually doesn't look like a prophecy when you're reading it. After the fact, you find out it's prophetic. Out of Egypt did I call my son. That's Hosea chapter 11 and verse 1, where God was saying that back in Hosea's day. He was saying that of Israel, how Israel had been brought out of Egypt. But here is Jesus as Israel incarnate, acting out the part of Israel, also goes into Egypt and will be brought out of Egypt. And finally, now I'm switching back to Luke's account. In Luke's account, we read, and it passes over all that instance with the Magi and going down to Egypt. Luke doesn't make any mention of that. But instead, he says, when they had performed everything according to the law of the Lord. Now, Luke's speaking of the things in the temple, but perhaps this includes the things that happen in Bethlehem and the things that happen in Egypt, all of that. They returned to Galilee, their own city of Nazareth. And this is where Jesus is going to be raised, in this little tiny village of Nazareth, located in southern Galilee. Now, in our time remaining, I want to look at what we refer to as the Passover incident. Luke is the one who tells us the story, and we've jumped forward 12 years. So Luke chapter 2, verse 41, now his parents went to Jerusalem every year at the feast of the Passover. And when he became 12, this is when Jesus becomes 12 years old, they went up there according to the custom of the feast. Of course, they'd gone every year, but this is an instance when he's 12 years old. And as they were returning after spending the full number of days, they would be there for the Feast of Unleavened Bread, the boy Jesus stayed behind in Jerusalem. Unknown to his parents for the rest of the verse, but his parents were unaware of it, but supposed him to be in the caravan, and went a day's journey, and they began looking for him among their relatives and acquaintances, and lo and behold, they've lost Jesus. Verse 45, when they did not find him, they returned to Jerusalem looking for him. Then after 3 days, it's interesting how this takes place. 3 days. 3 days that Jesus was in the tomb. For 3 days, they've lost Jesus. And after 3 days, they found him in the temple, sitting in the midst of the teachers, both listening to them and asking them questions. And all who heard him were amazed at his understanding and his answers. So even though he's only 12 years old, he exhibits quite amazing understanding, and he's asking questions. And notice, not just asking questions, he's giving answers as well. Verse 48, when they saw him, they were astonished. This is Mary and Joseph. And his mother said to him, because Luke's always giving us the story of both the birth and now the childhood and very young adulthood of Jesus through his mother's eyes. His mother said to him, son, why have you treated us this way? Behold, your father and I have been anxiously looking for you. And he said to them, why is it that you were looking for me? Did you not know that I had to be in my Father's? And our translation supplies the word house. The Greek doesn't actually say in my Father's blank. It doesn't actually give us anything there. The King James, the old King James says, I had to be about my Father's business. But I think the reason why our newer translations insert the word house is because I had to be not about, but in. And the Greek preposition there is there, in my Father's something. Well, in my Father, they were in the temple, so that would fit. And I think both ideas are here. He is about his Father's business. He is in his Father's temple. He is in the temple itself, not in the innermost part, but in the outer courts. But notice how he refers to God as his Father. And notice the double reference. Behold, your Father and I have been looking for you. And Jesus says, no, I had to be in my Father's place, in my Father's house. As if that Jesus already understood, already at the age of 12. He had a sense of self-identity as to who he really was. You see, he had grown up. And we're going to see in a minute, it's going to speak of Jesus' growth. Let's look at the next verse. He went down with them and came to Nazareth, and he continued in subjection to them. And his mother treasured all these things in her heart. That's what had been said earlier at the birth of Jesus. But again, she is treasuring these things in her heart. Verse 52, and Jesus kept increasing in wisdom. You see, even though we look at Jesus theologically and we think God in the flesh, and I think that's an appropriate thing to do. But there is an increasing in wisdom. There is growth, both physical growth and mental growth, because he had been born, we want to say fully God, yes, but also fully man. And that required growth. And he notice increasing in wisdom and stature and in favor with both God and men. And so we see a picture of him understanding who he is, understanding his purpose, understanding what it is for which he had come into the world, and yet also growing as he prepares to be the man that he will become. But we'll look at that story next time.